I'm delighted that in a way, our final conversation of this session is between Nuria Enguita Mayo, who's sitting nearest to me, and Anna Longoni. Nuria is an art historian and curator. From 1991 to 1998, she worked as a curator in IVAM in Valencia, and she was from 1998 to 2008, so almost for the last 10 years, chief curator at the Fundació Antoni Tàpies in Barcelona, where she curated many important exhibitions, and was during that time a member of the curatorial team of Manifesto 4 in Frankfurt. Nuria is now currently part of the UNEA Direction Committee, as well as on the After All editorial team. Recently, she curated the exhibition Eulalia Valderosa Dependencias at the Museum at the Reina Sofia in Madrid. Nuria lives and works still in Valencia. Anna Longoni is a writer and researcher who specializes in the articulations between art and politics in Latin America in the 20th century. She holds a PhD in arts from the University of Buenos Aires, where she currently lectures in graduate and postgraduate courses. Longoni coordinates the research group Culture as Resistance, interpretations of cultural and artistic productions during the last dictatorship in Argentina, at the University of Buenos Aires, and teaches on the Independent Studies program in MACBA, Barcelona. In addition to writing, she is active as an editor, serving on the editorial groups of the magazines Ramona and Desbordes. She is also an active member since its foundation in 2007 of the Red de Concepcionalismos del Sur, or the advice of Southern Conceptualism. Longoni lives and works in Buenos Aires. Thank you, Nuria.
Well, thank you very much. I really wanted to give a special thanks to Charles, Maria, Catherine and Cosmin and all the people at back for their help in organizing everything related to my being here. And also indirectly I would like to thank David Reef. I don't know if he's present because having focusing on Russia allows me better to focus on Spain, which I think is still a kind of exotic country. I don't know if we are part of the former West or we are from the former West, or the former best, as Anna Longoni was saying. In any case, I think it's important to bring here the situation from the margins of Europe and to give a very quick historical and cultural context explanation. Well, I would like to begin with a general remark, which is the first that came to my mind when I received this invitation, and which, of course, everybody knows this, but as modernity comprises a number of asymmetric situations that have many inequalities, dominating forces and dominated space, but as it has been said these days also, as if we are all in a situation of modernity, every cultural and social context lives and undergoes continuous processes of change and transformation. Processes which are heterogeneous and define situations that that cannot be superimposed. So the issue for me would be more to question these moments, which some theorists and also Jalal the other day said, call them black holes. These moments of asymmetric development, which makes us be sure that we have to consider the falls of history not kind of synchronous. So even if certain events like the fall of the Berlin Wall, of course, have global consequences, these consequences are, let's say, inserted in different realities. As I said, the disappearance of the system of blocks and what was known as the end of the Cold War had, of course, very diverse effects on different European countries and not European countries, of course. So I would like to draw attention to the asymmetrical realities of Spain in relation to other states in the region. It naturally belongs to Europe and the West, which in fact I think is the core of this seminar. So I'm also sorry for going back so far in time, but we should not forget that between 1936 and 1939, Spain waged her own war that brought a period of social and cultural opening under a republican government to an end, to be replaced by a 40-year dictatorship. The country formed an alliance with the United States already at that moment, as you all know, signing the treaties of two development plans, one in 1953 and the other in 1959, which placed Spain fully in the capitalist world, especially after the government formed by Franco in 1962. 20 years after, in 1982, 7 years after Franco's death, the Socialist Party won the general elections. 1 year before, Spain had joined NATO, and 4 years later, 1986, she would join the European Community. So I agree with Charles that dates are symbolic, but I think it's important to bring these dates because it gives a parallel history to maybe the former West. The Socialist Party started from a diagnosis of Spain as a backward country, from what I think they thought it was a progressive ideology totally aligned with the capitalist bloc. It set about and probably succeeded in its way in modernizing the country, in spite of the industrial restructurings and the spectacular rise of unemployment and corruption. From the very first, culture became the driving force for social transformation, and the space where modernity, which in this case was not synonymous with the avant-garde, unfolded. However, contrary to what took place in other countries, particularly those in the East, I would say, eager for rethinking their history and restoring their stolen identities, or in the countries in South America, mainly in Argentina. Chile is different. Already during the dictatorship and in the aftermath of the last military rule, a strong civil society immediately sought information regarding the black times of the dictatorship. Upon Franco's death, antagonist and resistance practices were completely silenced, and the system of art was depoliticized. What was favored instead was an ideological framework in keeping with capitalist democracies, and hence a mercantilistic artistic production in the service of power. As pointed out by scholars Alberto López Cuenca or Jesús Carrillo on the subject of the creation of the Arco Art Fair in 1982, at a time when Spain had no museum infrastructure to present and disseminate contemporary art. So this means that in Spain we began with the market before than with the institutions. Jesús Carrillo wrote, "It's not only that governments promoted the commercialization of the art world and the recovery of the object as a consumer article, following at that moment the international trend, but that thanks to the emphatic identification of this transformation with the modernization and Europeanization of the country, the symbolic value of art was used to define the identity of the new Spain as a capitalist democracy." So this is very briefly how the first years of euphoria and enthusiasm transpired in Spain, years that culminated in what I consider to be a key date for our country, which is 1992. So 3 years after 89, but This, I think, it was a really turning point in our cultural history. 1992 was the 5th centenary of the discovery of America. So, in Spain we didn't have either the post-colonial studies translated. So, but let's say that this date appears as, or we realize that of our colonial past and our post-colonial present. That year was celebrated also and really linked to the first thing, the Universal Exhibition in Sevilla, which again celebrates the discovery of America. 1992 was the Olympic Games in Barcelona, which marked the first appearance of the Barcelona brand name that came to a disastrous end in 2004 with the Forum of the Cultures. We had, of course, the cultural capital of Europe was Madrid, and last but not least, the Guggenheim Basque Government Consortium was set up to build a new Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao. And today, listening to Simon, I remind also that it was the year of new Spanish art all over the world. I mean, all these official exhibitions all over the West, the former West, I would say, not all over the world. So in an ostentatious and almost pornographic way, culture served political representation, which in turn was endeavoring to cover up an incipient economical crisis and a total lack of political representativeness, which I think this is in character with the international left, after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So these years, let's say, was the swan song of the socialist government, which would lose the general elections in 1996 to the right-wing Popular Party, and then we all know the history. And 1992 was also could be a turning point towards other ways of understanding art in Spain. More in the trend of what have been discussed mainly today regarding exhibition and institution. So alongside with the emergence of figures from the anti-Franco resistance, some of the practices silenced in the 80s also surfaced, and we could say that the country came out, from the very beginning of its isolation. Not before, as they thought, the politicians. I believe this change to a more engaged, critical and collaborative art practice was consolidated in 1997, partly as a result of the work of artists and critics. Some of the country institutions at that time, I think the Valencian Institute of Modern Art in Valencia, the Tapis Foundation in Barcelona, Ivan was opened in 1989, Tapis Foundation was opened in 1990, and the Center of Exhibitions, which was the former Reina Sofia, they did a really incredible work at that time. On the influence, of course, of the first international biennials and Documenta 10, and also the events organized by the social movements that culminated in Seattle in 1999, and which, by the beginning of our present decade, had turned Barcelona into one of the summer residencies of the anti-system movement. Well, this is, as I said, a very quick story of the, let's say, official institutional contest. But I would like to suggest some exceptions produced in Spain that maybe draw a different picture. In 1987, Arteleku was opened in San Sebastian. Arteleku means the House of Art. In 1987, so it's one of the, at that moment, one of the most advanced and far-reaching initiatives of the 80s and 90s in Spain. In contrast with the spectacular infrastructures built in other cities, it was set up as a center of production, designed to communicate and disseminate ideas and artistic productions although it also enabled free experimentation and artistic expression. Arteleku soon became a model for, at least for my generation at that moment. It was created as a support center for fine art colleges, organizing workshops and other activities, but it went on very quickly to integrate objectives in the field of creation, research, training and reflection. Formally and informally, the process favored connections and flows of varying intensity between artists and thinkers who belonged to different generations and followed different guidelines. Although after 1997 the Basque Country continued to be a culturally active contest, and despite, I would say, the influence of the Guggenheim, the mainstay of the art policies, at that moment I would say Barcelona was emerging as another center of experimentation, and mainly because of the rise of the right-wing party in Spain and in places as Valencia. That has been, at the beginning of the 90s, quite a reference. Let's say Catalonia became the place where, other forms of experimental practices happened. And in a moment also that I would say we had a very solid institutional contest, a very well organized alternative scene, and a very active university. So by the start of 2000, I want to mention also the project, a group of people and organization, including, again, Arteleku, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Barcelona, the International University of Andalucía, Unia Arte y Pensamiento, and Centro José Guerrero in Granada, began under the name of Disagreements on Art, Politics and the Public Sphere in Spain. According to the editorial published in the first issue, Disagreements, Desacuerdos, hope to trace a wide variety of cultural practices, models, and counter-models that do not respond to the prevailing structures, policies, and practices imposed in the 80s, at that privileged moment of historical transition in the modernization of Spain. At the same time, Disagreements, Desacuerdos aims to draw up a critical historiography of such structures and policies that, despite having failed, are still maintained today. So this has been a kind of former Spain, like in the former West Logic project, that has really, it has really an incredible work of trying really to write another history. It's now, it was like 2 or 3 exhibitions, a lot of seminars, and now 5 publications, which are a reference now for this moment in Spain. But I would say then 2004 is another key date for our country. As you also know, we had our own specific 11th September that year, on 11th March, as a result of which the Socialist Party rose to power again after Aznar lost the general elections. But 2004, at least for us in Barcelona, for the ones who were living in Barcelona, was also a year that revealed some of the flaws in the system. In 2004, the Universal Forum of Cultures brought to light the resounding failure of the city's local administration, although I must say it was a moment of hope for the well-organized protest against this event. At that time, we organized an exhibition focusing on tourism, which paid special attention to the Barcelona model, as you all know already, at that moment well known and copied in several parts of the world, which is, of course, a neoliberalist, revanchist model city. In our catalogue, Xavier Antic wrote, I quote, "Modernist Barcelona is enthroned, and the industrial working-class city that made it possible is forgotten. A non-existing Gothic quartier is glorified, which has as its most photographed icons a sequence of anachronistic pastis built with an eye on tourists in the early 20th century. The turbulent history of the 20th century, which can still be read on some ballet-marked facades, gives way to the virtual image of a paradisiacal city with no conflicts, which is almost entirely occupied, if we are to believe the advertising photographs, by the middle and upper classes who live there and treat it as a massive residential area, redesigned as a consumer and leisure space. In effect, as the 80s project proposed, the city has become entirely readable. But in those spaces where the test was full of crossings out, there are now only clinically redrawn blank spaces. So like so many other global cities, Barcelona has ceased to be a place and has moved on to become a post-historical non-place. A city which is a urban space where the citizens have ceased to have any role as protagonists and subjects of the transformations, where they must play their brave new role as objects and consumers." End of quote. Well, this could be read as, I'm afraid, a pessimistic metaphor of our own particular transition to democracy, where political struggle was replaced by normalization and where Spanish people seem to move from one set of dangerous stereotypes, which in the 60s, as some of you maybe remind, prompted the tourist slogan, "Spain is different," implying also political opening to the West, to the political aperture during the Franco period, to another new set of domesticated clichés, not so dangerous anymore, which, let's say, substitute the inequality for the difference, so erasing all possible source of conflict and emphasize a folkloric and empty difference. This may explain why Spain has only begun to look back on the unclear events of her recent past only from the beginning of this decade. We have needed 30 years after the dictator's death to be able to draw up a law, the law on historical memory, that will publicly acknowledge some of the facts of our past. In my opinion, although it's a weak law, for it's based more on gestures than actual restitutions, and is therefore more symbolic than operational, it may perhaps open a door for civil society, art, and activism to come together. Thank you very much.
First, I'd like to apologize for my English. I don't use it very often, but I hope you'll understand me. Second, I want to thank Maria, Charles, Cosmin, Marika, Doreen, and the rest of the organizers of the first former West Congress for the possibility to be here. I am a member since its foundation in 2007 of the Red Conceptualismos del Sur, the Southern Conceptualist Network, an international platform for collective work, thinking, and stance-taking. The network is now integrated by almost 45 artists and researchers from different parts of Latin America and Europe. Two other members of the network are present here, Miguel Lopez from Peru and Fernanda Nogueira from Brazil. We all feel compelled to have a political bearing on the processes that neutralize the critical potential of conceptual practices since the 60s. I hope will generate a fruitful relationship with the former West project. Today, I will focus on artistic activism during the last decade in Argentina, particularly in 2001, an emblematic landmark in and out of Argentina, because of the bank crisis, the collapse of the neoliberal policy, the government fall, and especially the new forms of popular uprising. I'd like to talk about the recent history of the actual situation of certain practices that I propose to name artistic activism, recovering the old self-definition of German Dadaism. I gather under this definition mostly collective production and actions that tap artistic resources with the goal of taking a stance in the public sphere. The image, please. Symmetric. Two moments are crucial to the emergence, proliferation, and vitality of the artistic activist practices linked to the new social movements in Argentina in the last decade. The first is in the mid-90s, a decade marked for the stripping of the state and the vacuous ostentation of the neoliberal policy. In this context, there emerged a few isolated groups of artists that promoted intervention in the streets as well as in artistic spaces. Two of these groups are GAC, Grupo de Arte Callejero, Street Art Group, and etc. Today, the error is international, whose origins are closely bound to the birth of Hijos, the human rights organization that gathers the sons and daughters of the disappeared, exiles, and militants of the 60s and the 70s. Both groups actively collaborate in staging scratches, exposure protests, the mode adopted by the struggle for human rights on the face of the impunity enjoyed by the perpetrators of the genocide. The scratch arises from the need to stimulate social condemnation of the repressors who had either been exempted for prison or simply not brought to trial thanks for the legal impunity granted them. The scratch discloses the repressor's identity, face, address, and above all, his past as a repressor. To his neighbors and workmates who know nothing about his criminal record. Ever since 1997, GAG has been producing the scratches graphic. Their typical notices subvert the traffic code by pretending to depict an ordinary traffic sign. Such a sign might well pass unnoticed for the unaware spectator, while what they are really pointing to is, for example, the proximity of what used to be a clandestine detention center, 500 meters away, of the airfield from where this flight took off carrying on them detainees to be dumped still alive into the sea, or a claim for the trial and punishment of the repressor. Etc., on the other hand, contributed to scratches by staging stunning theatre performances where huge dummies and masked people and in disguise played torture scenes, shower repressors stealing a newborn baby from its mother in prison, a member of the armed force relieving his conscience with confessing his crimes to a priest, or a football game where Argentina played against Argentina in reference to the 1978 World Cup. Both the gags, urban signposting, and etc. performance were at the beginning completely invisible to the art world as art actions. Nevertheless, they gave the scratch identity and visibility and contribute to generate new ways of fighting impunity. The second moment is around the 2001 crisis that led to the unprecedented popular uprising and disturbances of December, in which new social movements played a leading role. This unrest lasted until President Néstor Kirchner's inauguration in mid-2003. During this period, many artist collectives became involved in the broad call for substantial change in the political system, summed up in the radical slogan "Que se vayan todos," out with them all. These groups went through an intense time of activism. They were showered with requests for assembly and pickets, overloaded with calls to frequent demonstrations. They went as far as to produce weekly actions. Artists who belong to more than one group moves from one action to another in a matter of minutes. In the heat of the revolt, a significant number of visual artists, film and video makers, poets, alternative journalists, thinkers, and social activists invent new forms of intervention linked to social events and movements in the expectation they'd change life in Argentina. Popular assemblies, pickets, factories recovered from inactivity by their farm workers, movements of the unemployed, bartering clubs, and so on. Of the new groups, some had an ephemeral existence linked to a particular moment, while others survived until not long ago, such as TPS, Taller Popular de Serigrafía, Silk Screen Printing Popular Workshop. TPS originated for a concrete request made by a popular assembly. All of a sudden, they found themselves printing garments, whatever people wear, and take off in amorous demand during political meetings by working with a repertory that both plunders and pays homage to the Russian constructivists, the Argentinian conceptual artist Victor Grippo, and other distant references. TPS tries to provide the struggle with an image that may identify the time and place of the protest. They do so on the basis of a one-to-one exchange in a protest context, from the hand that prints to the hand that offers a personal garment in a potlatch act. The effect is opposite. The effect is opposite to uniforming people, the action of a voluntary mark on the clothes and on the body. As part of the same atmosphere, many other initiatives originate, whose chief aims did not lie in establishing a connection with popular mobilization, but in recreating social bonds and generating new ways of life and experience. Proyecto Venus, defined itself as an experimental association network composed of about 200 people who exchange either symbolic goods or service and use a currency internal to the group or else undertake joint project. PTV, Partido Transportista de Votantes, Voters Transport Party, appears as a serious parody of a political party whose single platform consists in providing transport to the voting center. In the city of Córdoba, they had about 20 permanent and 300 sporadic members, an extraordinarily real articulation among people. Since Kirchner's government came to power in 2003, political and economic stability and a hegemonic pact for governance have been reestablished. In this new and complex scenario, social movements are disbanding, losing the impetus they once had, and in many cases reverting to traditional political relations based on patronage and party. Among the new forms of activism, a sharp division has opened between those who support the government and those who oppose it. This divide profoundly separates people who not long ago took part in the same struggle about human rights policies. Now, I'd like to inquire about dilemmas and new directions responding to the visibility and legitimacy of the international art circuit gained by this group and their practices. Also about the impact that the overexposure at the international level in the last years had on these practices and its effects. The unexpected intensity of the Argentinian uprising caused the attention of intellectuals and activists as well as artists and curators from other parts of the world, who glimpsed in this turbulent process a new and vital socio-cultural laboratory. This focus of interest gave a certain international visibility to some practices which until then had remained on the margin of art. In this context, artistic activist groups were subject to intense attention and wide international circulation. Some groups were catapulted into prestigious biennales and shows in Europe, America, Asia, and even Oceania. Today, after other global disturbances had drawn the attention temporarily focused on Argentina, we have to face the implication of this enormous international overexposure. The new visibility has affected them, impacting their practices, their ideas, the network of relationships and affinities they have constructed. In short, the whole framework underlying their collective and individual subjectivities. The first group to go through this experience that the GAC. Their most critical moment occurred in 2003, following the invitation to participate in the 50th Venice Biennale. The swift arc propelling them from street activists to inclusion in such prominent international art spaces generate a strong tension within the group. These are finally resolved when they decide, after several more experiences and much discussion, not to show their productions in conventional exhibition spaces. From some, Venice means €2,400 for their street activities. Others think this inclusion in mainstream art is not for free. There are always a price to pay. Another thing, Venice as a possibility to resound. Brian Holmes ceased talking about this dilemma. In the age of corporate patronage and the neoliberal state, art is becoming a field of extreme hypocrisy. The temptation is then to cease playing the game, the anarchist solution, or to simply exploit the museum resources for other ends, radical media pragmatism. Both positions are justified from the activist point of view. The most interesting question within the artistic field then becomes how to play the exhibition game in such a way that something real can actually be won. In the case of TPS, the consequences of this overexposure were dramatic. In a few months, between 2006 and 2007, they were invited to 4 biennales and as important local and international exhibitions. This big demand forced the group to concentrate purely on these events, disrupting their active links with social movements and compelling them to dissolve. The actual situation of the artistic activists in Argentina is confusing and contradictory, but not necessarily dark. Some groups have disintegrated, some others still persist actively, and new ones are emerging. And above all, there is the most important legacy of last decade activists, especially around the symbolic 2001. Since then, all social protest, whatever its nature, taps to creative resources. A nice example of this is the performance staged by an ordinary family swinging by the banking system. Parents and children choose to spend their holidays inside the premises of the bank that refuse to return their savings. The whole family settled down in the building, wearing their bathing suits and keeping their suntan lotion at hand. A legacy that is about creating new ways of life and relating to others, about turning shortage, grief, and wrath into something else, into a colorful call to others in times of frenzy and social creativity. Thanks.
Well, now we have to dialogue. Well, of course, I knew what Anna was saying, and for me, I'm not talking about the activism in. I mean, I could have prepared more history of institutions. I could have prepared more a history of activism, or I decided to put this frame because I think it's. I mean, what is going on now in Spain, I think is known for every one of you, and now it's. I mean, you can. But what is very interesting for me of what Anna, I mean, of the Argentina situation that Anna is investigating, is researching and writing on it, is what I think is a completely different situation in, at least in our country, in the West, which is that the activism has. Well, this is my opinion, of course. I mean, someone would disagree for sure. But activism, from my point of view, mainly again in Barcelona, not in Madrid, but has been under the umbrella of the institution, and has not never. Taking really the streets. I mean, taking really the people. They have taken the streets in a very ludic and interesting and critical way against. Also because I think in Barcelona when we have this very activist movement that the Museum of Contemporary Art was implied, and it was an incredible situation. The museum was confronted against the public. The government, the Spanish government at that moment. Was I would say was more a part of a global wave coming directly from Seattle against the monetary fund that has a meeting in Barcelona. So, I mean, I don't know if it's it's not a question, it's just a commentary that when that's why I finish with this, which is also very problematic. This law on historical memory and the relation with the art projects and the art institutions is, it has to be really worked, because it's not. But in a way, it's a moment that I would say in Spain the civil society are in a parallel effort with the art and the activism.
Excuse my English, please. I would think the Argentinian case of the artistic activists in the last decade as a part of the recent cycle of the global protest in the rest of the world. Many groups in middle of the 90s in Europe and in USA and in America emerging and transformed the conception of the political practices, the idea of the radical creativity in new forms of the politic. And the situation in Argentina is specific, but is part of this movement, absolutely. And the contamination and the implication and the affinities in this emerging global, in all parts of the world is very potent. And Marion says about her group in Vienna, but in Paris, in Barcelona, and just desacuerdos exhibit this process in Spain. Groups as Yo Mango and other groups actuaban played in streets as part of the exhibition in the museum in the same time. And these questions are very problematic for the group. The relation in the activist practices and the inclusion in the dispositive of the museum and the exhibition is a big problem, a big paradox.
Hello?
Not a question, but maybe maybe a question too. What is very striking for me, maybe this is an important time to see if we can reconcile them, listening to the presentations yesterday by Tom Hollat, Helmut, and Christian, talking about institutional critique, and I think looking at some of the projects of collectives in Germany at this particular time, and then your two presentations. And what is very striking is that on the one hand, on this side is a concern with institutional critique, and here you're talking about civil society. Do you see any kind of reciprocal relationship between the notion of institutional critique as formulated, within the kind of practices mentioned yesterday, and what in this Spain's context will be civil society? Is there any kind of reciprocity that you can see, both in terms of methodology and relationship to the artistic sphere?
Well, I would say I'm not even an expert in but I think it's it's an important question, because also relating to to what Simon Syke said this morning, for me, I think the institutional critique now could be, after the first or second waves, could be understood at something which is, a critique which is coming from the art, let's say, from the art world or from the artist, but it's going, I mean, it has a resound effect out of the art world, but then so it reverts to the art world in a changing position. So it's a kind of institutional critique which has to be with the, let's say, external, with the society at large, but then it's coming back to the art system to criticize itself. So it's a little bit also as I think it was, I don't remember, Helmut or Christian, saying that it's not so much or as much against anymore the institution, but also to the system of art, or even to the spectator or even the artist. So I for sure.
This is a question to Anna, and concerning the post-authoritarian situation in Argentina, among others, and the role of the tradition of activism in South America in the 1960s. It was so important for culture and for politics. We used to even say that on the contrary to European or North American art, where politics was a part of the art sphere and was a sort of political art, in South America there was not political art but politics as such. There was a very strong tradition which has been lost, of course, during the dictatorships, not only in Argentina, but also in Brazil, maybe less in Brazil, but particularly in Argentina. So my question is, what is the relationships, how strong this activism, what you've been talking about, the 90s, what strong is comparing this sort of activities to, let's say, real art and gallery art or something like this. What do you think about the topography and the position in the whole Argentinian culture of both of them?
Okay.
If I understood.
The first part of your question. The tradition of the relationship between arts and politics in Argentina, in Latin America, is very old. For example, in the first decade of the 20th century, emerged a group of anarchists, grabadores, silkscreams, that repaired his works in the doors of the factories. Artistas del pueblo, people artists. And this tradition is very complex and very interesting, and is habitually excluding of the canonical history of art in Argentina. But a group of researchers are recovering this episode. But I think that I sospecho, I'm a friend that in Europe and in other parts exists this tradition alternative, but is similarly is excluding of the relates of the history, canonical history. And I am sure, for example, in the 80s in USA, the activism in torno to the epidemic of SIDA, HIV, origins groups as ACT UP, for example, and it's very important for the forms of the activism in the communication of and the articulation of the activists in torno of the HIV, for example, but is excluding of the officially relays of the arts. And it's real that the institutional circuit in Argentina in Latin America is more weak, and the autonomy of this circuit in periods of the dictatorship is inexistent, and for this circumstance is more frequent that this episode occur out of the field of the art. But the institutions in the center, in the West, permit other dialogues, other possibilities, other resources. But la segunda parte de la pregunta era... Ya quedó. Excuse me. Sí. Con la institución. Okay.
We've got one more question for Anna. Sorry to march you with English. Thank you for both of your presentations, which I found extremely insightful in the relations of politics as official politics, activist politics, and what art plays a role in between that. And I wanted to ask because I met people from Etc. in several instances in Germany, and we met together with artist activists from Israel and artist activists from Germany. And I found it really interesting because in Germany there have been practices like those of Etc. in the 90s with an anti-fascist group called KUK, Kunst und Kampf, Art and Battle, which were reenacting different police uniforms of National Socialism, Wilhelminian area, going through all of this, which would in Germany no longer be allowed because this is now either declared defensive weaponry or it's banned by the state. Basically, you can't do this form of practice any longer. And the Israeli group was saying that they actually tried to reenact things which Etc. had done in Argentina, but which totally did not work out in Israel, because they were trying to form the same concept of working with public blame politically, but the context was totally different. So my question was, as you have this network, as you're working in the network, as Charles introduced you, did you discuss questions of translating those practices to different contexts?
¿Cómo que ocurre cuando las prácticas vienen aquí? Yes. I think that these practices are specific and in a historical context, in a specific situation in the history, and it's very problematic the translation, but the translation as una receta, ¿cómo se dice? Recipe, as a recipe, but the idea of legacy of resources that in other situations, in other geopolitical situations, in other historical situations are reactivated, re-emerged, is very potent. The idea of the originality of the resources is stupid in this context. The possibility of the reactivation of this legacy is more evident. For example, a ver si me sale. Las fuentes.
The resources?
No, fuentes de agua. Fonts. Fountain. In 1968, in Buenos Aires, a group of avant-garde wanted teñir of red the water of the fountain, but in homage of Che Guevara. But the action fracasó, is a failure. And in 2000 in Peru, the idea are recycled in other contexts very different, and the action of the Lava la Bandera clean the fly.
Was the flag.
Was
the flag.
Was the flag. In the context of the dictatorship of Fujimori. And the same idea is recycled and repotential in other contexts politic. It's a legacy or a group of resources that return. Yes.
I think one of the most important things you are doing now, this network of conceptualisms of the South, is to really to try all these political, I would not say activists, because it's really, as Piotr says, it's political, it's nothing to do with art at that moment. And to research, to put together, to study, in order to give it to the, as a legacy to the. Finally, it's not a recipe, but it's a catalogue of resistance, which I think is very important.
And I think I'm going to have to break in there and to invite us all. Thank you, first of all, Nuria.